Hi, I'm Martha Dunlop and I'm here to read you the first chapter of the Starfolk Arcana, which is the first book in my new paranormal trilogy. Chapter 1. Beth. Beth sighed and slouched down in her front row seat at the TV studio. If she'd known she was going to be subjected to this drivel, she wouldn't have come. She'd been here for 2 hours already and not one of the stories had been genuine. Her so-called friend and flatmate had a lot to answer for. She was pleased Laura loved her new job, and it had been obvious her friend's enthusiasm about the chat show was overblown, but this was worse than she had expected. She caught a movement out of the corner of her eye and turned. Laura was standing off to the side of the set, waving her clipboard at Beth. She shifted on her mile-high spikes. Her feet must have been so uncomfortable. But Laura had been determined to make an impression today. Her eyes were bright as she scanned the set, drinking in her world. This job was her triumph. Beth couldn't fault her enthusiasm. She just wished Laura had left her out of today's charade. Seated at the dais, Catherine Havisham waited for a moment, eyebrows raised, bright red lips pursed. Thank you for staying with us over the break. I know this is the moment you've been waiting for. Model and it girl Amelia Faustus is here, live on Deep and Dark, to break her silence over the horrific out-of-body attack that took her from the media spotlight. After weeks of fear and soul-searching, she has decided to step back into the public eye. Amelia, welcome. Tell us what happened. Catherine leaned forward. Start from the beginning. Her posture mirrored Amelia's, but their faces couldn't have been more different. Amelia was trying hard to look demure. Catherine was trying not to laugh. Amelia couldn't have looked less traumatised if she'd arrived straight from the spa. She looked around the audience, head tilted so the glossy black curtain of hair fell as a backdrop to the too perfect mask of her face. Her high cheekbones had a sheen as though she had been crying, but her eyes were bright and clear. She shifted in her seat, crossing her legs and allowing the white pencil skirt to rise a little farther up her tanned thigh. It's been a harrowing few weeks, but my decision to speak out, to bring attention to this awful, aggressive force, has given me a new reason to get out of bed each day. Most people would never have noticed the tension in Amelia's eyes. Beth wouldn't have seen it herself if she hadn't felt the pressure, a coil of anger that sent a sliver of cold through Beth's chest before Amelia looped it back in. Beth sat up, searching her body for the familiar signals that something unseen was present. She allowed her awareness to reach out. There was a buzz around her from the rapt attention of the audience. It lifted her mood, and the dread eased for a moment. She was tempted to let her guard slip, but this vanished as the thread of darkness twined its way from Amelia and out towards each member of the audience. For a moment Beth felt it. She watched the threads in her mind's eye as they snaked out towards her. Then, before they reached her, she visualised herself in the middle of a ball of pure white light. The threads fell uselessly at her feet. Amelia narrowed her eyes as she gazed out at the audience. She scanned the rows of people in the ultra-modern TV studio, taking in the transfixed faces, and then Beth. For a moment, her bright red lips tightened, but then they stretched into an attempt at a smile. Amelia shook her head. I'm so sorry, Catherine, darling. I'm so easily distracted these days. It all started the night my mother died. I'm sure you can imagine how devastated I felt. To lose her was to lose a part of myself. Catherine nodded, her forehead drawn in sympathy. I slept in my mother's house that night. Amelia's voice was soft, but the room was so silent it was easy to hear her. Beth couldn't shake the feeling that Amelia was talking directly to her, as though they were on their own, sipping wine by the fire. She peered around the room. Most people sat forwards, leaning their elbows on their laps. Amelia had them reeled in like fish on big barbarous hooks. Beth shook her head, strengthening the ball of white light and pushing the woman's energy back. She would not be part of the catch. Of course, I didn't really sleep, Amelia laughed. How could I? There was someone in my room, and I had not invited him to be there. There was a muttering in the audience. People shuffled in their seats. Amelia waited, her head still tilted, her lips lifting in a barely perceptible smile. I had opened my mind, Amelia continued, her voice even quieter now. People drew in to listen, moving forward, straining to get as close as possible. Even the cameras moved closer. I wanted to see if I could feel my mother, to find out if she was still here with me in any way at all. And was she? Catherine was flushed. She leaned in too, put one hand on Amelia's arm. If she was, I didn't feel her. Instead, I felt a man in my room. I saw him so clearly with my eyes closed. I knew in my logical mind there was no way a strange man could suddenly appear in my room with no warning. But here's the terrifying thing. For a moment, I wanted him to be there, whoever he was. I wanted to connect with that ghostly intruder more than I have ever wanted anything in my life. I wanted it more than I longed for my own mother who had only left me that day. It felt as though he was luring me in with promises of peace and love. Can you believe that? A woman sitting behind Beth sobbed. Beth bit back a laugh. She was a pro at empathy, but this was ridiculous. The woman had been offered a gift, and she was pretending it was a nightmare. Awful, Catherine said, and Beth wondered if she was the only one who noticed the sarcasm. Amelia nodded and wiped the corner of her dry, unsmudged eye with a folded silk handkerchief. I'm so pleased you hear me, Catherine, darling. I knew you were the right person to talk to. You're so understanding, such a good listener. You do so well at letting your guests speak their truths without interruption. Beth coughed violently in an attempt to cover the laughter that would have attracted all the wrong kinds of attention. Catherine was notorious for being a tough interviewer and digging up the worst kind of dirt. She was never flustered, emotional, or caught off guard, but for some reason, right now, she looked furious. Her face was flushed, her arms were crossed tightly, protectively even, over her chest. "Cut!" a voice shouted. The audience began to shuffle and mutter as members of the crew rushed back and forth. A pale woman with dark circles under her eyes hurried over to Amelia and started touching up her makeup. Someone with a clipboard talked to Catherine while a camera was moved into a better position. A man walked onto the stage, handed a glass of water to Amelia and crouched down beside Catherine. Dressed in jeans and a fitted black top, his shoulder-length dark blonde hair pulled into a ponytail at the nape of his neck, he looked unaccountably different. Beth massaged her neck as she watched him. She wanted to be able to say he was dressed strangely, but he wasn't. It was as though he was perfectly camouflaged to all except her. He moved seamlessly through the flow of people, a word here, a touch there, but nothing that disrupted the fast-paced movement of the crew. Beth forced herself to turn away, but she felt his presence to her left, his energy tugging at her mind. "What made you think this ghost was there to hurt you?" Catherine's voice broke in on her thoughts. The studio had fallen silent. "I just knew it, Catherine, darling. Haven't you ever known something, deep in your heart?" Catherine laughed, but her lips barely moved. "It's not my heart we're here to talk about." Beth leaned back in her chair. She knew all about just knowing, and she just knew something was seriously off with Amelia. Why would she feel so threatened by a spirit offering peace and love? Since when was that frightening? And why, oh why did she feel the world needed to hear about it? Beth felt something tugging at her mind and turned. The man from the stage was now standing at the back of the audience. He was watching her. Why did she feel she had met him before? She couldn't see him clearly from this distance and felt a weird urge to go and introduce herself, to get a clearer look. Something indefinable about his face was strikingly different to anyone she had seen before. but at the same time he was achingly familiar. Beth blinked. For a moment, his ears looked pointed, but when she looked again, they were perfectly normal. She turned back to the set, her heart pounding, mind reeling. Amelia was still talking, and Beth did her best to suppress the annoyance that surged through her. The woman had an unreasonable ability to get to her. Beth knew she was being prickly, but something was off, and she couldn't work out what. The spirit offered his hand. Amelia's voice was hypnotic as she leaned forwards in her chair, looking first at Catherine and then out to the audience. She spoke softly, intimately. I knew if I took it, I would lose myself entirely. I would no longer be the Amelia the world recognised. My soul would be in danger. In danger from what exactly? Beth muttered under her breath. Beings offering peace and love. Terrifying. There was a sharp intake of breath. The woman to her right pulled back, eyes wide, face pale as she shielded her daughter from Beth. The little girl watched her, leaning forwards, her face flushed, head tilted to one side. A camera swiveled around to point at Beth. She rolled her eyes. How loudly had she spoken? Catherine nodded to someone on her left. Beth followed her gaze and saw the same man walking towards her. She hadn't seen his face up close, but now he held her gaze, smiling encouragement. For some reason, she felt as though he were willing her to do well. His features were fine, sculpted even. His narrow, angular face was somehow out of place in the modern and transient surroundings of the television studio. His upward slanting eyebrows were oddly familiar. Beth smiled back. She was determined to look serene, despite the butterflies swarming in her stomach. But Amelia was watching her. The woman's almost entirely contained anger was pointed right at Beth. She strengthened her psychic protections, but the energy still seeped through, making her heart pound and her stomach feel like lead. It's not real, she repeated to herself over and over like a mantra. The man crouched down and held out a microphone. Would you like to speak? His voice was deep, his eyes a rich blue that seemed almost violet at the edges. His ears were profoundly normal. I wouldn't, but somebody obviously wants to ask me a question. I may as well get it over with. He handed her the microphone. She took it. Smiling, he held her gaze for a moment too long. Please, introduce yourself, Catherine said, nodding with a friendly smile. Beth felt a moment's connection. This well-manicured and formidable woman didn't like Amelia any more than she did. My name's Beth. And what was that you said? Could you repeat it for the benefit of the audience here and at home? Beth swallowed. She could see herself in one of the monitors. Her dark eyes looked huge against her pale skin. She wished she'd made more of an effort. The simple plait looked out of place in this cavernously sterile room. The indigo tunic and leggings seemed somehow from a different time. She pulled herself up, holding her shoulders straight and proud as she looked at Amelia. I was just wondering why you thought you were in danger. Since you didn't take the offered hand, we have no idea what would have actually happened. To suggest that it posed some kind of threat is pure speculation. Beth felt a rush of warmth from somewhere outside of her and caught the scent of lavender. Sister. The single word echoed in her mind. She shook her head. Where did that come from? She was an only child. Nobody's sister. Excellent questions, Beth, Catherine nodded, unable to hide her smirk. Amelia stood up. She smoothed her shimmering white top over the waistline of her white pencil skirt. Then she reached up and scooped all of her hair over one shoulder so it hung down in a glossy dark mane to her left elbow. Despite the towering stilettos, she didn't so much walk as prowl like some kind of predator. Beth cursed her seat in the front row. If she'd been farther back, she wouldn't have attracted so much attention, no matter how many loud comments she made. Beth, is it? I once knew someone who looked like you. Amelia's voice was smooth, her smile faultless. She held out her hand. Beth paused and then took it. It was icy cold. She winced at the strength of Amelia's grip, but held the smile on her face. "I'm so pleased you came, Beth." Amelia dropped her hand and then turned to the rest of the audience. "In fact, it's so wonderful to see all of you, to feel your love at this challenging time and to share my story with you. You don't really have a story though, do you?" Beth felt the audience's shock as a physical wave of adrenaline. "I'm sorry your mother died. It was clearly hugely traumatic, and I can see why your minds might turn to ghosts. But nothing happened." The audience muttered and shuffled in their seats. Amelia paled, pursing her lips as she glared at Beth. There was a low murmur from the woman to her right. She leaned in close to her daughter, lips moving fast as she whispered in her ear. The back of her neck was flushed where it was exposed by her scraped back hair. She turned, pressing her lips together as she glared at Beth. Despite this, the discomfort of other people's fear was less than normal. The warmth Beth had felt a moment ago enveloped her, offering a layer of protection that allowed her to breathe. Beth concentrated, trying to see Amelia's aura. There was nothing. She must have been shielding it, although Beth had no idea how she was doing it. Odd. She'd never met anyone with that talent or inclination. "Nothing happened because I was on alert." Amelia narrowed her eyes at Beth. "You would understand if you were practiced in following your intuition." Beth gave a hard laugh. Amelia wasn't as good at reading people as she was at shielding herself from them. Not many people lived by their intuition as much as Beth. She was used to being misunderstood, but for some reason she felt oddly disappointed that Amelia wasn't more perceptive. "Perhaps you just mistrust it." Amelia stepped closer. The people on the front row leaned forwards, trying to get as close to her as possible. "Do you honestly doubt my experience, Beth?" She held Beth's gaze, as though attempting to entrance her. A prickle ran down Beth's spine. She focused, calling on the lavender warmth to push Amelia back, to form a protective barrier around her mind. "Salud," Amelia muttered. The tip of her one exposed ear turned pink, but she held her composure. "Sorry?" Beth frowned. "What does that mean?" Amelia was silent for a moment, her jaw tight. For the first time she seemed disconcerted, at a loss what to say. Then she laughed, not her normal flirtatious laugh, but a genuine chuckle. "Oh, nothing. It's an obscure expression." Then she turned and walked up the stairs of the aisle between the rows of seats. "Amelia," was a whisper in the air as the audience shifted to watch her walk past, unable to take their eyes off her. A teenage girl stuck out her hand and Amelia grasped it, and then pulled her into a hug. More arms reached. Soon she was surrounded by people, touching her and hugging her as she whispered words of warning. Beth watched her, lips pressed into a tight line. Was Amelia stark raving mad, or was she speaking the truth? Whichever it was, her ability to enchant people was staggering. "Ahem!" The woman to her right coughed, glaring at Beth as she nodded towards the aisle, yanking her daughter after her as Beth moved her legs out of the way. "Don't touch her," the woman said from between gritted teeth, pulling her daughter out into the aisle. The girl turned when she got to the steps and looked at Beth, her blue eyes wide and confused. She tilted her head and pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. She took in a breath and then paused. Beth raised her eyebrows, intrigued. The woman turned, saw the silent exchange and grabbed her daughter's hand, yanking her up the steps. Beth rolled her eyes. A warm hand brushed against hers and she turned. The man still stood next to her, his eyes almost purple. "Amelia is pretty formidable. Not many people can see past her. It's a shame the audience won't remember you standing up to her." "They won't? Look at them. She has them mesmerised. That will take up all the space in their minds." "You sound as if you know her well." "Well enough, or at least I know how she works her way into people's heads." "We go way back. Would you mind?" he said, slipping the microphone from between her fingers. Of course. Have you worked with Catherine long? No, I fill in occasionally when they need more staff. It's lovely to meet you, Beth. You too. Can I ask your name? I feel as I've seen you before. The man smiled. Jonan. My name's Jonan. Beth's heart beat faster. I don't know why, but it sounds familiar. Jonan's smile widened. Maybe we'll meet again soon. Then it will be even more familiar. He winked and then turned and walked back to the stage. I hope you enjoyed my first chapter. It's from the Starfolk Arcana, which is the first book in the Starfolk trilogy. And you can find it on Amazon, and you can order it from your bookshop and library. You can also find out more information on my website, which is www.marthadunlop.com, and you can find me on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you soon. Thanks very much. Bye bye.